All right, so today we're going to be talking about site plans, plats, erosion control, things like that, annotations and guidelines that we need to continue some of the stuff that we were covering previously. So here's our learning objectives for today. We're going to identify items needed to create a set of design drawings for civil engineering design. We're going to be able to differentiate these items needed for each of the following. So we're going to be talking about site plans, landscape plans, and grading plans today. Now there's a lot more things that have to be provided, but these are the ones that we're going to be addressing throughout the rest of the semester. So I wanted to highlight these. And one of the other things I want to do, especially when we're talking about site plans, is to try to identify some of the items that are needed to be considered before we start designing out that site. Putting a building on it, putting parking lot, bringing in utilities, things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit today too, and that will directly influence our next homework, which is site design. So today we're going to cover some of this stuff. We're going to try to tie it all together. So we've kind of already messed around with drawing out parking lots and all that for a site, and we've talked about some of the other things that we've done. We brought in a surface, we did things like that. So we created a parcel, and then in that parcel we had things like large retail, small retail, things like that. So there's certain things that we've already done on the front end that's going to make our task a little bit easier as we go on. So I had this before, but I want to go back over it. When you're drawing an individual construction site, there's certain things that you have to provide, information that you have to have. So project location, where the building's going, location of utilities, driveways, walkways, all that stuff. The city expects to see that whenever you turn in your drawings and all to be approved by the city or whatever agency you happen to be going for. Now, in addition to that, depending on what it is, and this is especially true for roads and things like that, sometimes they're going to require specific software to be used. In the case of College Station, and this is really Bryan too, you've got to have an application fee. You've got to have copies of the site plan, copies of the landscape plan. You have to have the building elevations for all the buildings that you're putting in. That is the base elevation as well as the height of the buildings. You want to list the materials. You have to have like color samples, electronic copies because they want to bring this stuff in and they're going to tie it into GIS information, things like that. So they would like the electronic copies. And then you're also going to have your grading plan, your drainage plan, your erosion control, and all that. That's just submitted to the city. That isn't your construction drawings. That's not the entire set, but that's what's expected for the city. So here's the three things we're going to talk about. The site plan, showing locations of roads, main buildings, etc. Grading plan and report defining grading surfaces, things like that. And then the landscape plan. And we'll talk about how you develop a couple of these. So let's cover the site plan first. So there are a bunch of questions you need to ask before you begin to develop out your site. First off, like what's going there? Is it going to be a house, a store, a restaurant, a hotel? What's the square footage of the building you're putting on? Or maybe how many rooms or things like that. These questions start creating new questions that you have to answer. What are special considerations? So does it have to be in a specific spot on the property? Entrances, minimum turn radiuses. Just a simple location on the property thing. If you're opening a bar, it has to be a specific distance. The front door has to be a specific distance away from schools and churches. So literally how you locate your front door on your property could determine whether or not you can have a bar that's close to one of those things. Just a little interesting note. And then there's other design things like what type of ground surface am I building on and all that. We're going to be using really the use of the property to kind of develop out our site because we really don't have a lot of information that you'll be able to apply for the other things. So that's going to be kind of our starting point. So we're going to kind of design it based on the use of the site, and then that will answer some of the questions that we need as far as our homework assignments, grading, things like that go. So as a good example, let's go over and say that we want to do a fast food restaurant. Well, there's a specific amount of parking spaces you need for a fast food restaurant. In this case, there's 8 plus 1 per 50 square feet of seating area. Maybe you want it to be a school. Well, we already talked about this. An elementary school in Bryan College Station needs 1 spot for every 20 students. So we're not just talking the building that's going to be developed and the building pad that it's going to be sitting on, but what parking are you going to have access to? What roads are you going to have access to? Things like that. So here's a good example. One of the things that you have to provide in your site plan is a parking data table. And let's say we have a sit-down restaurant, and it's 2,500 square feet that this sit-down restaurant is. And so we need to figure out what's the minimum amount of parking spaces we need to have in our parking area, because that has to be provided whenever you're sending this into the city. So we're going to go over, we pull out the manual, we look at the manual, and it says, okay, general restaurant or cafeteria. Okay, that fits. We need 1.25 parking spaces per 100 square feet of the square footage, plus any spaces or whatever for banquet rooms. Of the total number of parking spaces, there needs to be 3 handicap parking spaces for the first 75. So that's another additional thing. That's an ADA rule. And then for every number of 25 spaces afterwards, you need to add a handicap space. So if you're at 75, you need 3. If you're at 76, you need 4. If you're at 100, you still need 4. If you're 101, you need 5, something like that. And so if we plug that in our case, we have standard parking, restaurant. The area is 2,500 square feet. The ratio that we have is 1.25 spaces per 100 foot squared. And so what we end up with is we need 25 spaces. We also need 3 handicap spaces. So that gives us 28 total spaces that we need. Now, we could provide a whole lot more. We could have 30 standard spaces, 4 handicap spaces, whatever, but we need at least that minimum, and then you need to show it. So you create a table like what's shown here. Here's some of the other things that I'm going to want and actually are normally asked for in a site plan drawing. And so let's kind of go over some of these. First one is just, all the items on your property. So that's the first thing that you have to show, and that's roads, sidewalks, parking lots, building pads. If you have a pond, you got to show it. If you got a lake, you got to show it. All those things you have to show in your drawing. Then you're supposed to show the finished ground contours. Now, we're going to kind of do our homework a little out of order, and we won't have our grading done yet before we do our site plan. But you should have your ground contours showing, and the finished ground contours would be the ones that you would use after you've graded out your site. You've already developed for how the water is going to flow off your site, things like that. So that would be the major contours, minor contours, things like that. You also want to show things like flow of traffic. And so you want to highlight the different things that are involved with that. And so like in this case, if you look at the arrows and all that, that's showing how the traffic flows. If you look on this one area, we have this kind of drive-through, and that's a one-way. And then we have other areas that are going to be two-way driving. Then, of course, you want to show all your handicap parking spaces. You want to identify them, and you want to show that they're following the regulations. So you got to show dimensions and things like that. Here's the parking data table I talked about. And so you want to have it listed out with all the information you you have in the thing. And then it ends up that you always end up having a couple things that maybe it's a lot easier to write out than necessarily show. And so a lot of times you're going to have things like notes. And so if you look right here, here's the signage note. And all the signage will be permitted separately and approved of this site plan does not constitute approval of any proposed signage. So they put in a note that says, okay, we're going to put it in, we're going to follow that. Another one down here, the floodplain note. No portion of this development is contained within the FEMA floodplain as shown on community panel and all that. So these are things that you would put in notes that so you wouldn't necessarily have to deal with it in the drawing. So that is the site plan. Well, whenever you're developing a site plan, you're developing it and you're showing all the things. You're adding blacktop, you're adding parking spaces, you're adding rows, things like that. Well, that's going to affect how you have water runoff, how you have a lot of things like that. And so you also have to include a grading plan. And this is a report defining the graded surfaces and slabs for the site. And so this is also where you get your final design surface. It also talks about how much earth you're moving and things like that. And so if you look at that, you have all your standard details. You have your finished surface, you have your cut amounts, you have your fill amounts, you have a net cut and fill, and things like that. You're showing the elevations, you have spot elevations and all this on your property so they can identify the thing, even if you have contour lines and things like that. Now, we're going to go over that a little bit more when we do our grading homework, which will be after the site plan. So I'll go into this detail a little bit more. The last thing that you need is a landscape plan. Now, sometimes you'll farm this out, sometimes you won't. It kind of depends on what the project is. But a landscape plan is going to be basically showing what you're putting on the property that you are developing. Now, you can't just go and have parking lot from one edge to another, your whole property, you put a building on there and you concrete everything over. That's not acceptable. And so what they say is, okay, you have a certain requirement that you have to develop back in, adding in trees, adding in grass and things like that. And that's part of your landscape plan. Now, what they normally do is they base this on the square footage that you're actually developing. And so if you're developing 30,000 acres, 30,000 square feet, 30,000 acres would be a lot. 30,000 square feet, then that's the number that you start with. And then things like trees and grass and stuff like that count towards what you're being developed. And so what you'll end up doing is you'll show all of your trees, things like that. You'll come in, any grass you'll normally hatch out. You'll also notice they have a variety of trees here for their landscape plan, and they use different blocks for that. So if they're going to do that, they're going to need to have some sort of legend showing what each of them mean. And so like you have here queen palms and red maples and southern magnolia and things like that. And then they also show the hatching for the sod and things like that are going in the area. And then you have your landscape analysis of your property. And I'm going to show how to do that in just a second. So here's how we're going to end up doing it. The total square footage of your area is the number you need to start off with. Okay, so like I said, 30,000, something like that. Now, what's the total area that you're developing? And that can be where you're putting parking, slabs, whatever. What you'll do is you'll turn in, and in Bryan College Station, it's, depending on where it is, it's 15% of that square footage. I think College Station's 17 and Bryan's 15, but it's 15% of that square footage needs to be paid back by adding in landscape. Now, with that being in mind, you can't say, oh, I'm just going to add grass in, because only 15% of that 15% can actually be counted for landscape grass. So you can add more grass, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can count that towards your total. Then you have things like canopy trees. These would be the big trees, oaks, elms, things like that. Those count in Bryan College Station as 350 square feet worth of points, if you will. Ornamental trees, so those would be the nice ones like crepe myrtles, Chinese pear, things like that, only count 150 square feet. And so your goal is to either match or be greater than your developed area. And then the total points for coverage and how much each item counts can be found normally in the site manual. Sometimes I'll have it completely separate one, but in Bryan College Station, especially in Bryan, it's in the site manual. So let's say I'm developing out an acre lot. So small retail, developing it out, but I'm only using about 2/3 of the lot, so about 30,000 square feet. So in College Station, I would need 17% of that developed area would be what I would have to pay back in landscape, which comes out to about 5,000 square feet, or 5,000 points, if you will. Now, 15% of that can be applied to grass, so that would be around 750 points. And like I said, you can have more grass, but you can only count 750 square feet of it. So I go ahead, I take that out. Now I'm at about 4,250 as opposed to what I need. But there's a couple trees I haven't taken out. These are trees that are on the property that I developed, but I just protected them. They are nice coverage. They're nice old trees. I don't want to get rid of them. And so those are on the area that I developed, but I protected them out. Let's say there's 10 in this case. Those count as 225 points per tree that can be applied to the points. And so that would be 2,000 points that I can take off of that, or 2,250. And so that leaves me with 2,000 points. And then that's kind of here I am. So let's see what I'm going to add. Let's say I'm adding 8 oak trees. We're going to run them along the front. It'll be a nice little intro into my building and all that. And so those are full canopy trees. And then around the building, I want to have some nice looking ones, nice looking little trees. So I add some crepe myrtles and things like that. Those count about 150 points. So you start adding those up. So 8 times 350, 12 times 250, and you start subtracting that from your total. It should be interesting to note, it's like, well, why do I have a fully developed tree and it only counts 225 points? The reason why is that some trees will be fine, especially in this area. They'll be fine. They've been around for hundreds of years, but they're actually really sensitive to things like vibration and all. And so when you're building your building, it actually starts damaging them, and they end up dying shortly after the building's built. Or maybe your grading and all that has moved water away that they normally have and things like that. And so what they're doing here is they're saying, okay, well, we're not going to count those as much because there's no guarantee that they will survive. The stuff you put in later, you're kind of not tearing up that ground as much, and so they count those as slightly more points. So what you end up with when you're doing something like a landscape plan is something like this. So here's my developed site area, total points required. 50% of that in College Station has to be trees. Out of that 50% of that has to be canopy trees. Then they come in, and here's some of the other stuff. So here's the newly planted. Here's the existing tree credit. So I had 10 trees there. That's 2,250. Here's my newly planted canopy trees. That's 2,800. Here's my non-canopy. That's 1,800. And then my grass that I put in. And so after I subtract all that, my total points that I actually have created is 7,615 feet squared. And the total required points, though, is 5,100 feet squared. So I'm good to go as far as that go. And I would have to have this on that drawing so that they can see it and see that I calculated out and figured out what I needed. So in conclusion, when developing an area, there are a lot of things to consider. You can't just place a building on a site without considering the infrastructure needed to be in place to support that structure. And that can be roads, parking, utilities, all sorts of things. Once you have designed a site, the city and state, construction people and all that, they need to have a set of well-developed design drawings covering every aspect of the design. And we're not going to hit every aspect in this class, but we'll hit some of the ones that are kind of the primary ones. So like a site plan, like a grading plan, things like that. Now, the first one that we're actually going to develop out is going to be the site plan. And we'll have a homework assignment on that coming right